The single core Space Marine rule, Oath of Moment, is confirmed to be losing a lot of power in the new codex. Let's talk about Games Workshop's decision with that one, and whether or not it's a good or bad thing overall. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd focus specifically on the Oath of Moment change in the upcoming codex. Perhaps a slightly surprising change coming out of the new book. Space Marines will gain a lot of interesting rules and detachment support and things, but despite being a somewhat mid-tier army at the moment, their core faction rule is going to get nerfed very heavily. Games Workshop confirmed this in the first preview article for the Space Marine Codex. The words they used were that now you can only reroll hit rolls against the Oath of Moment target instead of hit rolls and wound rolls against that. An enormous cut in focal damage power for the Space Marine Codex, though it is still going to be a helpful buff against shooting that one enemy unit. Apparently there will be at least a few more ways to access full wound rerolls in the codex, though in all honesty I'm a little bit skeptical as to how widespread it would be. I know we already have twin linked weapons and things like that, but so far I don't think we've seen anything like that out of the previews that we've seen so far. And if they go by the same sort of styling as in the Tyranid Codex, I'd expect the vast majority of datasheets to stay roughly the same this time. I wouldn't expect too many units to get crazy buffs like that going forward. It certainly isn't really a very good feels-good change for the new Codex launch, at least for Space Marine players anyway. Space Marines have only one unifying faction rule, and it maybe doesn't really feel like that much of a selling point to make it much less powerful. It'll be a big nerf not just to core Space Marines, but all of their divergent chapters, things like Black Templars and Blood Angels and things. I feel like it's maybe not too surprising though. The rule did feel a bit weird as it was a fairly ridiculously powerful damage buff, more so than most other things in Warhammer 40k, and was maybe a bit swingy depending on what army that you were playing, basically being just enormously powerful if your opponent had any big durability units that they were trying to use to carry the game, things like big blocks of Terminators or Titanic Imperial Knights, but wasn't really enormously useful against armies with a whole load of lighter units that like to run around, and might have been at least fairly easy to kill anyway. At least prior to the Codex, I think it's maybe hard to argue it was too much of a problem in terms of faction versus faction power level though. Marines were kind of middling to low in power prior to the balance updates, probably Oath of Moment being a factor in keeping them where they were as opposed to being even weaker. The fact that the change is coming now makes me wonder when it was planned. It does seem a bit of a strange decision to go from one rule with 4 hit rolls and 4 wound rerolls when the 40k indexes were released, and then in really quite a short space of time decide to revise things and just go for hit rerolls instead. Games Workshop's known to have a bit of a lead time on when they can write codexes and send them to the printer and get them shipped around the world to distribute. Although that takes a fair amount of time, it does limit when they can make revisions to the documents, supposedly at least a few months in advance. It kind of makes me wonder whether it might have been after the rule was shown off, but before the digital indexes came out, where a lot of people's initial reactions were just that Oath of Moment looked like it was a bit of a strange move given that they were adding loads of rerolls into a game that they were trying to limit rerolls in, and it seemed kind of hard to balance for Space Marines against factions with big tough units that care about it, and armies that don't have to rely on those so much. I did find it interesting as well that the new rule with just the hit rerolls mirrors the Combat Patrol version of the rule. I thought that was done for power scaling and seemed like quite a good decision really, as it probably would have been kind of overpowered in tiny 500 points-ish games, but seems it was just a forerunner for what was to come for the rest of Warhammer 40k. By the numbers, I must admit, the damage buff provided by Old Oath of Moment was pretty ridiculous. If you're hitting on a 3+ and wounding an enemy target on a 3+ as well, it would equate to around about an 80% damage boost. You'd expect units in that situation to do almost double the damage, and then that goes up to double if you're wounding on a 4+, or goes up to even crazier if you're hitting on a 3+ and then wounding on a 5. Because it was better against even tougher targets that you tended to be wounding on higher numbers. It was particularly quite nice for things like, say, Hellblasters with mid-strength plasma weapons, which could be very general purpose if Oath was on the go, and really quite good for any sort of spammed small arms as well. Desolation Marines and their Castellan launchers certainly made good use of it when they were really good. Compared to that, new Oath of Moment is definitely a lot weaker. Often for Space Marines you're going to be re-rolling hit rolls at Ballistic Skill 3+, that's normally going to be a 33% damage increase, so not really on the same raw power level as any of the other numbers above. Space Marine Focus 5 is still going to be slightly unusually good, but nowhere near the slightly arbitrary astronomical levels that it was against one marked target. If you have things like Lieutenants or other things with lethal hits though, New Oath could still be good for fishing for lethal hits. Often it could still make sense to roll everything besides 6s to try and also wound the enemy as much as possible if you're wounding on a 5+ or worse. Overall though, I definitely consider this really quite a big nerf to Space Marine power, so hopefully the codex is going to have enough good stuff to help balance that out. To ask people what they thought of the new change, I thought I'd do a quick community poll, and overall the main takeaway that I get from that is that the community is fairly split on it. Around about 40% of people like it, rating it either very good or just good, 26% dislike the change, saying it's either bad or very bad, and 34% are neutral, not really minding too much or don't really care. It seems that slightly more people are in favour of Oath of Moment changing than not, though the numbers aren't huge. Most people in the comments for that seeming to cite that it's probably better for the shape of the game, and it might be good that Space Marines are not balanced around Oath of Moment, but are a bit more powerful on their own datasheets, which seems reasonable enough to me. Does kind of make me wonder what the distribution might have been if I'd asked specifically Space Marine players on one poll and other factions players on another. I have a feeling that the factions numbers might be a little bit more skewed to disliking it if it's your own faction getting nerfed quite heavily. Obviously that needn't be the case for any one person though. As Space Marine firepower gets weaned off the massive boosts that come from rerolling all wound rolls, I feel like a few things are going to be affected a bit disproportionately. Anything with built-in rerolls will care really quite a lot less. Twin-linked weapons, Eradicators, or the Gladiator Lancer all won't be caring quite so much that full wound rerolls are going away. And unless points changes quite a bit, then generally anything that was a twin-linked weapon might just have a little bit more value in the Space Marine army going forward. Torrent weapons, a lot of people have identified as being a bit of a weird and unusual case. If Games Workshop really is keeping the rules super simple and just saying you get to re-roll hit rolls against the targets, then torrent weapons like the new Pyroblasters are just going to find the rule completely useless for them as they don't roll to hit in the first place. I guess it's possible that Games Workshop could have anticipated that, but they certainly didn't hint at any sort of specific exception for flamer-type weapons when they teased the rule. Perhaps allowing things like torrent weapons to re-roll wound rolls instead might have been sensible, or giving Space Marine players the choice of either hit rerolls or wound rerolls rather than just being locked to hits only might not have been the worst. I feel like if that were the case though, then people might be choosing wound rerolls really quite a lot of the time. Otherwise, for units affected a little bit unusually, devastating wounds weapons will go down in value a bit. Things like Stern Guard fishing 4/6s to get those all-important devastating wounds will make them a bit less reliable against heavily armoured or high toughness type targets. Gilliman definitely won't be enjoying the change, as using double oath is his thing. Lower strength or mid-strength weapons more broadly will perhaps have a little bit less general purpose value. Things like Hellblasters won't be able to punch up against tanks quite so easily. And I feel like melee armies might care just a little bit less about the oath change compared with shooting ones. In general, it's a rule that's a bit easier to use with a massive gun line focusing fire on one thing. If you're using Oath on a melee target, often you might just be boosting one Space Marine melee unit that made the charge. You don't generally tend to attack with your entire army in melee against one target, but sometimes it can make sense when you're shooting. In general though, I feel like Games Workshop probably will be able to get Space Marines into a place where they're fairly balanced without having to just rely on Oath. I feel like it might be the better choice overall in the long run, given that it kind of distorts the wound table and makes a lot of things that aren't very good at killing tanks suddenly very good at killing them. And I feel like we've perhaps already seen Oath of Moment distort some points costs as well, things like Stern Guard going up, perhaps partly just due to being so good when firing at Oath of Moment targets. Currently, post the balance data slate, Marines seem to be around about a 46 to 47% win rate, so if Oath of Moment were just changed in isolation, that would probably be a bad thing for game balance. Space Marine players might just drop down a bit on that ranking. And just looking at the change in isolation, it doesn't really seem that Space Marines need the major nerf. At the moment though, it remains to be seen whether or not the new codex will add enough power and options to outweigh the nerf to Oath of Moment. Certainly if some of the new formations add a lot of power to the codex, then it means that even with Oath of Moment being toned down, they might well gain advantages and options that outweigh that, though of course we'll have to see what happens when it's all added up. In this age of 40k balance updates, I'd guess that Games Workshop won't be leaving it an enormous amount of time if Space Marines are massively underpowered. They'll probably just adjust some points costs or rules in the January balance data slate. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Oath of Moment change. Is it a good one or a bad one in your eyes? And what do you think Games Workshop's main motivation for making the change was? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. And if you'd like to help keep all these videos coming, then any support over there is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.